Welcome to the deep dive. We've received some really interesting material from you about Vladimir Putin's recent ceasefire announcement.
Yeah, the 30-hour one in Ukraine over Orthodox Easter weekend.
Exactly. It feels like a moment worth, well, digging into, doesn't it?
Absolutely. Such a brief pause in a war that's been going on for so long. It really makes you wonder, what was behind it.
Right. So our mission here is to try and understand the nuances. Was this actually about humanitarian concerns?
Or maybe a PR move. Or perhaps something else entirely strategic. Let's try and unpack it.
Okay, so the announcement itself. It seemed to drop quite suddenly Saturday morning.
Yes, pretty unexpected. And Putin specified the timing running until midnight Moscow time on Sunday.
Which, for listeners in the UK, that was 10 p.m. Sunday night.
And the stated reason,
Yeah.
just humanitarian considerations.
Pretty concise. But Ukraine's response was immediate, wasn't it? President Zelensky?
It was. He acknowledged it, said Ukraine would observe the quiet period too.
But he didn't leave it there.
No, not at all. He immediately countered, didn't he? He pushed for a much longer ceasefire.
30 days, unconditional. Referencing a proposal they'd already made, I think?
Exactly, from the previous month.
Yeah.
The idea being, to actually create some proper space for negotiations.
So it felt like Zelensky was saying, okay, 30 hours is nice, but if you're serious...
And show us something more substantial.
Yeah.
It definitely highlighted his skepticism about this being more than just a symbolic Easter thing.
Which leads us to the big question. What was really going on? What were the potential calculations?
Well, the sources we looked at float a few ideas. One perspective, I think it came from the BBC's Russia editor,
Okay.
suggested this might have been a signal, maybe aimed at the U.S.
A signal that what?
Potentially about Russia's openness to eventually ending the war, though, the sincerity is obviously the key question there.
So kind of testing the waters. Or trying to look reasonable.
Perhaps. Or maybe even trying to drive a bit of a wedge between Ukraine and its allies.
Interesting. And what about the domestic angle? Inside Russia?
That's definitely something to consider, too. With the sanctions biting and maybe some war fatigue. An announcement like this could be framed very effectively by Russian state media.
How so?
Well, portraying Putin as, compassionate, mindful of Orthodox Easter, countering that Western narrative of him being purely aggressive.
Right. Playing to the home audience, potentially boosting support or managing discontent.
Exactly. Especially when people are feeling the economic pressure.
And the timing. Orthodox Easter itself. That's significant, isn't it?
Hugely significant. It's a deeply important religious holiday for both Ukrainians and Russians. Shared faith, shared traditions.
Symbolism of peace, renewal.
Precisely. That imagery, even amidst a war, carries a lot of weight.
But there's a risk there too, surely, if the fighting doesn't actually stop.
Absolutely. As one source pointed out, that powerful symbolism can seem pretty hollow if, church services are happening while shelling continues nearby.
It highlights that potential gap between the words and the reality on the ground. Have we seen ceasefires like this before around holidays?
They have, yeah. It's not unprecedented. You see examples in Syria sometimes, Yemen.
And the famous World War I Christmas truce, of course.
That's the classic example, though quite different in origin, more spontaneous, from the soldiers up.
So what makes this one different then?
Well, the key thing our sources stress is that this was unilateral, declared by Russia alone.
Meaning no prior agreement with Ukraine.
Exactly. No deal, no agreed rules, no mechanisms to check if it was holding.
No international monitors on the ground or anything.
Nothing like that. It was just
Yeah.
an announcement, not a negotiated pause.
And did it hold? What did the reports say?
Well, reports indicated that fighting didn't completely stop. There might have been a reduction in some places.
Okay.
But sources mentioned continued activity. Places like Donetsk, Kharkiv, Zaporizhia were named.
So not a blanket silence across the front line.
Far from it, it seems. And without agreed protocols or observers, it's almost impossible to verify claims of who broke it, Makes it very fragile.
Which must have been incredibly difficult for Ukrainians trying to mark Easter.
Absolutely. I mean, maybe some in relatively safer areas could attend a service cautiously.
But for many others.
The threat was still very real. Still having to shelter, still hearing explosions perhaps. The huge disruption to such an important time.
Imagine that psychological impact. A brief pause, maybe, but filled with uncertainty.
Exactly. That constant threat, even during a supposed lull, just adds to the trauma.
Were there any sort of small positive effects? Did aid get through, for example?
There were some limited attempts, yes. Aid groups tried to use that short window to reach difficult areas with supplies.
And maybe local medics?
Yeah, reports mention medics trying to reach patients too.
But the time frame must have been a huge constraint. 30 hours isn't long.
It's incredibly short, especially given the danger and unpredictability. You likely can't mount large-scale aid efforts.
So the people most in need might not have benefited much.
That's a real concern, yes. It might not have been enough time to make a significant difference for the hardest-hit communities.
Which brings us back to the question of motive. Could this have been partly tactical for Russia?
Some sources definitely raise that possibility, using the pause to gain a bit of international goodwill.
Or even regrouping forces,
Yeah.
repositioning.
That's also been suggested. We've seen patterns like that, potentially, in past conflicts. Think Chechnya or Aleppo in Syria.
Or even eastern Ukraine back around 2015.
Mm-hmm. These unilateral pauses can sometimes serve military or political ends beyond just the humanitarian claim, reshaping the narrative, maybe probing the other side's reaction.
So how did the world react? Was there widespread welcome or skepticism?
Largely skepticism, it seems. The EU, for instance, welcomed the idea but sounded quite cautious.
Okay.
France called it a hopeful signal, but again, sort of reserved. Germany really stressed the need for verification.
Highlighting the trust issue.
Exactly. And the U.S. response was pretty measured, too. No sense that this was seen as a major breakthrough.
More focus on needing real actions, not just symbols.
Pretty much. The message was clear. Genuine progress requires more than a temporary pause.
What about China? Their position is always watched closely.
China praised the truce, actually. And they used it to repeat their call for a broader peace conference.
Has that gained any traction?
Not significantly among NATO countries, according to our sources. There's still a lot of caution about China's overall stance.
So, looking back at that Easter weekend ceasefire, what's the takeaway? Did it change anything fundamental?
Probably not, unfortunately. The assessment seems to be that the conflict remains pretty much deadlocked in a dangerous stalemate.
But maybe even a brief pause has some meaning.
I think so. Perhaps not politically right away, but on a human level. Even a fleeting moment without fighting could be a powerful reminder, can't it?
A reminder of what peace could actually feel like.
Exactly. And for Ukrainians experiencing Easter under those conditions, whether under threat or during that brief, fragile lull, that must resonate deeply.
It speaks to that enduring hope for peace, even in the darkest times.
It really does. That resilience is quite remarkable.
Well, thank you for helping us unpack all of that. It's certainly complex.
It is. Thanks for exploring it with us.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, maybe a final thought for our listeners to consider.
Yeah, it's worth thinking about that balance, isn't it, between gestures that look humanitarian and the underlying strategic games that might be playing out in these long conflicts.
And what it would actually take to move beyond these kinds of symbolic pauses towards something more lasting.
Exactly. What does a genuine step towards peace really look like in this situation? That's the crucial question to keep asking.
A really important point. Thanks again for being with us.